Adequate power supply is an unavoidable prerequisite for any nation's development, and electricity generation, transmission and distribution are capital-intensive activities requiring huge resources of both funds and capacity. However, Nigeria's power sector no doubt has been plagued with structural issues and in areas such as generation, gas supply, transmission and distribution, which has caused constant breakdown in the national grid, leading to unstable power supply across the country. The grid, which is being managed by government-owned TCN, has continued to suffer system collapse over the years amid lack of spinning reserves that's meant to forestall such occurrences, worsening the blackout being experienced by households and businesses in parts of the country. I have joining me live to discuss this and other issues is the former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, that's Dr. Sam Amadi. It's good to see you. Good afternoon, Dr. Amadi.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to start this way. We've been having system collapse. It's becoming recurrent decimal. It's no more news. Every time we hear grid collapse, and this grid is being managed by the TCN, according to what we know. Now, what could be responsible for this? Let's start that way. What could be responsible for the constant fallout and this grid collapse that we have in Nigeria?
Well, thank you. I guess first we need to acknowledge that constant system collapse is a function of a story about grid frailty. The grid is frail, and it could be for many reasons. Notable one is that our networks, especially transmission networks, are weak and oftentimes radial, which means they are not looped together. And so the level of reliability that you require to run the network is that still low. And of course, we know that our guys at TCN are working hard, but essentially we still don't have the scale operations at the level of coordination. One of the things you get when you unbundle the power sector is that you increase coordination problem, and that's where technology comes to help. So we are still running on a low rudimentary technology, and so occasional failures will occur. And again, there's also a contribution from the distribution network. What that means is that it's not just the TCN that has problem, because the discos network are also very weak. This is really seasoned. Trip-offs are many. They need to relay some of the lines. They're very weak. And what happens is sometimes the failure of the transmission could actually be triggered by collapse in the local grid. Again, volatility of supply, can also affect. You talk about spinning reserve and other redundancies that are in the network. Oftentimes they're not enough, and so sometimes it can lead to the level of collapse. But again, what makes it massive at a large scale, whether it's total collapse or partial collapse, is ultimately the quality of the grid. And so for some time we've been talking about more investment in network, international network, but that's also will be dependent on revenue recovery from the discos. That's dependent on the amount of power you can set to the grid. That depends on also the metering level and the change management strategy of these discos to protect revenue cycle, and therefore enhance the transmission capacity to invest and manage a much more reliable grid. And so back to the Siemens plan, back to the federal government meter rollout, all these initiatives are trying to solve a problem from that diverse point, but it looks like too little oftentimes is being done, because really the collapse, the symptoms and the underlying causes are widespread and systemic in a way, and therefore oftentimes this collapse reminds us that we're not anywhere near where we should be in terms of quantity, in terms of change management strategies, in terms of policy intervention, in terms of general project management.
Let's take a break. We'll continue this discussion immediately. Let's take a commercial break and we'll be back very shortly.
Information is power, information is security, information is knowledge. On Labor Lens, we believe that working people around the world have real questions of their own. They want to know how the world of work operates, what it means to the employer of labor, how policies affect workers in the workplace. On Labor Lens, I ensure we engage effectively the organized labor, organized private sector, and government to get out of them information workers are in need of. I am Sharon Jackson, asking questions that make you get sense of the workplace.
There is always more to a story than the screaming headline. The part of a story that is not told casts a shadow. It's like the part of an object that is not reached by light. On TVC News, I'm able to explore the many angles there are to a story, talking to stakeholders, asking the difficult questions, and digging for facts. I believe the viewers are able to make a better decision if they're well informed and understand not just a part, but the complete story. TVC News, first with breaking news.
All right, there. Now, we're looking at the power sector, and I have the former chairman of NERC, who's been speaking to us, Dr. Sam Amadi. Yes, Dr. Amadi, I want to take us a little bit back to the privatization exercise. Yes, some have still come out to fault this process, saying that it could have been better done, or maybe some, well, you are an expert, you'll be able to further explain that to us. But what do you make of that process, and are we really achieving what we ought to achieve from this process? We are still generating and distributing around 4,500 megawatts for a country of 200 million people after years of privatization.
Debate continues on privatization. My views are well known, and they are that first, that if I was to advise the policy phasing scheme, we shouldn't have privatized when we did, because of three reasons. One is that the level of regulatory certainty that you need to have a good post-privatization outcome, as we've shown from what has happened everywhere in the world, in Chile, in England, in Argentina, the level of regulatory stability and capability wasn't there at that point. Second is that unlike those countries like the UK that privatize, we are privatizing from acute shortage, acute scarcity. And so it's always better to ramp up capacity, have a market, a tradable quantity. So if you have like 18,000 megawatts, 10,000 megawatts, then the notion of a regulated private market begins to be more real than academic. And thirdly, is that at the level of risk and decay of our existing infrastructure and the utilities themselves before privatization, it was doubtful if any very serious investor with great technical and financial capability would have come to the market. So I think the process was good enough. We tried, BPE tried to be transparent, but essentially the proposition was wrong. I think we needed to fully corporatize and commercialize. Now the argument was this, that you need a shock therapy, and that was the neoliberal argument spreading abroad there. With the shock therapy, just get the market into a private hand, and the private ownership will incentivize efficiency. That's not true. What we should have done is an orderly transition from public ownership to private ownership. First, we build a corporate profile, we deal with the commercial issues, corporate governance. For example, until I became the chairman, we didn't have audited account of NEPA. We did the first audited account. We did the first meter inquiry. And up to today, there's still no clarity as to the customer numbers of the discos. We don't have a scientifically bankable customer base. So these are critical incidents of a commercially viable operation. So in a word, we privatize up too early, arguably, and again, we invested so much on private ownership to cure systemic wrong. So what we should be doing now is forget that debate and get back to what can we do to save the situation. I think what we can do is strengthen regulation, get much more, allow the regulator to play a key role, and then policy, leadership. Let's get the utilities, have cost-related tariff, but again, let's index them to the best corporate practice. And of course, government, as they're doing now, may have to make some very smart investment in the grid in spite of private ownership, but they'll also back it up step in right to order the discourse how they will improve service delivery. So essentially, we are back to where we started from. We need to get back to strengthening public policy aspect of the market, strengthening public investment of the market, strengthening regulation, and even strengthening public supervision and project management. Because essentially, this is not a market that is very fair to private sector to take all the systemic risk. We won't expect investors to deal with the transmission problem, to deal with even recovery revenue crisis, to deal with metering. And so what government is doing now, I've argued for meter to become a public service, provide meter for all Nigerian consumers, and they allow the discos charge them rates that justify production of power. So primarily, it's arguable whether we did the right thing in privatizing, but I think we did the right thing in the entire reform, in unbundling and in trying to commercialize the sector. But we could have probably by now, this is the right time in my view, would have been privatizing. We would have built up competence, improve efficiency, enhance regulatory capability, then the real strong guys in the market will come in and we will tactically and strategically begin to privatize some value chain and then build on experience with each of the phases to make the process better. It has to be interactive. It's a revolutionary process in moving from industry to market and not the way we did it in the shock therapy, I think.
I'd like to ask you what we could really call a cost-reflective tariff, because we've been talking about this tariff issue for some time, and I think Nigerians will want to understand what this means. There's also an argument that Nigeria is almost paying lowest when it comes to electricity tariff, maybe across the continent and all of that. So what do we really make of that cost-reflective tariff? What does it mean?
Well, I think cost-reflective tariff, in my view, it's both an art and a science. And what that means is that, look, oftentimes people forget the principles are clear. You want tariffs to reflect the real cost of doing business. But the way you design the tariff reflects the realities of society. And so my view about the price of this industry is not primarily tariff. Even if you increase the tariff by 200%, you discover that the discos will not make the revenue because the incentive to bypass to steal power will be high, because the people are not going to get commensurate service in the short to medium term. So my idea of cost-free tariff is two ways. One, allow the regulator to design and define a framework that is bankable and credible, so investors know that even if they don't get their returns today, they will get it tomorrow. Second, the regulator must be transparent and let customers know that although you don't have the quality of service, but you're going to have this level of tariff exposure. But these are the level of bankable power you're going to have. So we're going to have discos give us clear and reliable power schedule. They are doing it now by saying, look, if you're in this tariff bracket, you have this level of power improvement. But want to see it real and actionable. So if you create confidence, then you gradually move to a higher level of tariff that covers the cost more. And you improve with that, because the idea of cost-free tariff is not just about cost aspect. It's also about satisfaction. It's also about quality and service component. That's why I call it incentive regulation. You have to incentivize consumers to pay more. You have to incentivize producers to supply better service. And so what we are seeing today is that so much focus is on the pricing and not on the quality improvement side. So I want to see two of them together. We need the right tariffs that allow more investment in the sector, that allows investors to come in, allow those who are in to be able to invest more. At the same time, we have a tariff structure that gives consumers the reason to stay on the grid and not to want to steal power or move out of the grid or even sabotage the grid. I think if we keep inflating prices without taking into cognizance the quality of service the consumers receive, we get to a point where the incentive is very high for bypass, for power theft, and basically people opting out of the grid, and that will lead to grid collapse. So you have to be careful with so-called cost-effective tariff. It's a science, it's an art. A regulator must look at the socioeconomic factors and tailor the tariff and cost recovery in a manner that allows more people to consume power and get more value, at the same time allow investors to recover costs in increasing manner and have more incentive to reinvest in expanding capacity and sustenance.
Before I let you go, Dr. Amadi, I was going that route. Energy theft and non-payment is something that worries the discos. I think particularly the discos now, because they deal directly with the consumers, and they've been talking about this. Now, in what ways, I think, or do you think we also need a total attitudinal change to understand that this is no more government? It's privately run, so that we need to support the investors for them to also actualize their gain, and so they can add more to improve facilities or infrastructure across the power value chain? Or what do you really think needs to be done? That's for us as Nigerians to understand, because I know that some areas have almost 24-hour power supply. Is just bargaining with the discos, and this is working in so many places in Lagos. How can we improve or take advantage of schemes like that?
Think about decentralizing power, a much more liberal market where customer can interface with supplier directly and get the price they can pay. And so people talk about that, eligible customer and all kinds of devices. But again, don't forget that it's in the larger political economy interest that everybody consume minimal amount of power. So I would think that opting out, having that diverse pricing mechanism for different kinds of consumers' willingness to pay could be a good point. But the great thing here is this: we focus so much on moralizing, talk to customers. You see, look, get it this way. If you provide reliable power, if you match it to the transparent pricing mechanism, and you match it with continuous credible communication, town halls, capacity to lead to a discussion that will lead to tariff increase. So I'm more in support of institutional approach, which means create incentives, create accountability mechanism, create processes that are bankable, then increase tariff. That's what I like to see. That's the way I look at it. That's the way it should work.
All right, let's project before I let you go. If you can do that in 1 minute, what are your projections for the sector? This incremental power that we expect and all of that, how soon do you see it getting better, Dr. Amadi?
I think it will get better, but we have to do a couple of things. I think the leadership of the sector is weak at this point. We need to have strong leadership that's both communicating. This is important. This is the beginning of a reform. Reform requires communication. You need to communicate to all the stakeholders. You have to communicate to investors more assurances, communicate to consumers more assurances. Things are getting better. Show by numbers, show by improvement in service. So gradually we'll come to a point where we have a real market that can sustain the level of policy leap that we want to see. Then we can move to real customer tariffs. We can now have unbundled the sector, even unbundled distribution, and get to retail. So I think we're going to make progress, but we need real strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership that's stronger than we have right now of the sector. The regulator is doing fairly okay in terms of capacity, but we need a much more stronger leadership of the entire sector.
It's really good to have you on the show. Thank you so much. Dr. Sam Amadi is the former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, sharing your thoughts on developments in Nigeria's power industry. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much.